We're booting live stream. We're booting live stream. Oh, sorry about that.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this pop-up event, the third panel in a series called Apocalypse Pending: Religion, Politics, and Social Media. My name is Elizabeth Castelli. I'm a professor in the Religion Department at Barnard College and also the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Our topic today could not be more timely. If you're like me, you joined this event by taking a break from watching the trial currently underway in the United States Senate, in which the former occupant of the office of the presidency is accused of inciting insurrection among his followers. Today's panel focuses on the violent insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6th, its relationship to the QAnon phenomenon, and the religious dimensions of this phenomenon. And we only need to think of figures like the so-called Q Shaman to see these dimensions at work. The program today is sponsored by the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, and the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. Before I introduce our two panelists, I want to invite members of the audience to participate in the conversation by posting questions in the Q&A window available at the bottom of your Zoom screen. After our panelists have spoken and engaged with each other briefly, I will share as many of the questions as we have time for. In proper apocalyptic style, we are predicting an end time for this event at 3 o'clock. Today's panelists are exceptionally well positioned to help us understand the religious, apocalyptic, and New Age elements of the January 6th insurrection and the movements that spawned it. Will Sommer is a political reporter for the Daily Beast, and he's been reporting on QAnon regularly on that site. Will is also writing a book about QAnon, which is forthcoming from HarperCollins. Susannah Crockford is an anthropologist specializing in religion, ecology, and political economy. Her first monograph, Ripples of the Universe, Spirituality in Sedona, Arizona, is forthcoming in May from the University of Chicago Press. She's also published numerous articles in academic journals like Nova Religio, Religion, State, and Society, and Correspondences, among others, on New Age spirituality, conspiracy theories, and white supremacy. Will and Susannah will each make brief presentations. Will go first, followed by Susannah, and we'll follow that up with some exchange between the two of them and then open things up to audience questions. Welcome, everyone. Thank you.
Great. Okay, all right, I'll kick things off. First of all, thanks to the sponsors for having me and the audience for checking this out. I think it's a very interesting topic. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Will Sommer. I'm a reporter with the Daily Beast. sort of QAnon's my bailiwick. I've been covering it for a couple of years now. And I'm also working on a book about it. I think today I'd like to focus on the role the storm as a concept plays in QAnon as sort of both a religious moment, as a sort of utopian dream, and a very cathartic, violent one, and also how that played into January 6th. So I was there at the Capitol, and so the amount of people who were talking about the storm and who had dreams of the storm occurring that day were really high. So let's just dive on into it. So first of all, I think QAnon is kind of a woolly topic to get a hold of because it can handle so many things. And so I think that's also why it makes it both so appealing to so many people, but also can be an interesting topic. I mean, it's about sex and drugs and crime and money and terrorism and religion, of course. And so, but really at the center of it is the concept of the storm. And I think often we can get a little distracted by, the lizard people faction or the JFK Jr. faction, all these kind of different groups, but really and miss the fundamental thrust of QAnon, which is that the world is run by this cabal of satanic pedophiles in the government, in Hollywood, and banking, and that there's going to be this moment called the storm in which all these people are kind of violently dealt with. And I think it's important to understand that the storm isn't just, that congressman I don't like is going to go to Guantanamo Bay, although it certainly is that. But I think it's also sort of a lot of QAnon believers have sort of a sense that their own personal issues will be resolved. A little further in, we'll get into a guy who, a lot of QAnon believers think that their debts will be absolved by the storm. My first encounter with QAnon believers in the real world was a QAnon march in DC in April 2018, which drew a couple hundred people. And I was very struck when they would take the mic that they would talk about how the storm, there was a woman whose son was developmentally disabled and wasn't getting the support he needed in school. But she said, well, the cabal, once we take down the cabal, that'll be resolved. Or a guy who didn't have health insurance, but figured for his cancer, but that he could, get this issue resolved once Donald Trump does the storm and gets the cure for cancer. So you can see how often the storm is, it's very personal and often also aimed at one's sort of cultural enemies, such as, hence the focus on sort of QAnon pre-runner Pizzagate, which is really all about, anger at urban groups and gay people. And, they would go through these concerts and just be shocked by them. So really, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the storm, is very key in QAnon. Even in the run up to, obviously the phrase the storm comes from Donald Trump saying calm before the storm in October 2017, surrounded by a group of generals. Now, at the time, people thought this to be a reference to a potential war, probably with either Iran or North Korea. I think in retrospect, we can look back at it and say, this is just kind of the weird cryptic things Donald Trump loves to say, and they have no meaning. But for QAnon believers, and of course, QAnon was starting shortly after this, this comes to be sort of the central phrase of QAnon, along with where we go on, we go all. And they really sort of fixate on that. And pretty quickly after that, we start seeing the accretion of storm-related content onto QAnon. The obsession with sealed indictments. I was just listening to an old tape of Marjorie Taylor Greene today saying, there's thousands of sealed indictments for this storm. The talk about, obviously the first QAnon posts were about arresting Hillary Clinton. So really these are kind of key to all of it. And furthermore, we've already seen even before January 6th, we see how the storm plays out in violent incidents. I think of Matthew Wright in Arizona, who is a QAnon believer in late July 2018. QAnon believers had been convinced that the storm was coming with the release of this Inspector General report on the Hillary Clinton email investigation. And so Q and the Q promoters had sort of riled these people up for what was to be one of the earliest sort of missed dates for the storm. And then when the report comes out, it's boring, right? It's an Inspector General report. And so it's not the storm. And so while most QAnon believers kind of buckle down and obsess over another date, Matthew Wright, who's this kind of already unstable guy who's living in a armored truck that he's built, he blocks a bridge near the Hoover Dam with some guns, and he says, where's the, he holds up a sign that says, release the real IG report, which is QAnon believers believed, it was sort of like the storm was really just quite at hand, even if it hadn't happened. And so already we're sort of seeing, almost 3 years ago now, the way the storm kind of interacts with people and pushes them to the edge. the concept of this. Again, we see it with Anthony Camello, a young man who allegedly murdered a mafia boss in 2019. People were very confused about this murder. They said, what is, is this a hit? This is the first mafia boss in the United States to be murdered in decades. And then, of course, he gets into the courtroom and holds up a Q on his palm. So this is a fellow who, it was later revealed, was obsessed with the military tribunals aspect of the storm, which is also a key part of it. And so he had tried to do a citizen's arrest of Bill de Blasio, ultimately tried to do it on this mafia boss, Frankie Boy Cali. So, for years now, we've seen the ways that the storm concept in particular can really have a hold on QAnon believers and how that interacts. And then, of course, cut to January 6th. So I was in the crowd before the riot started, before there was just kind of a mood of menace. But I was really struck by how many QAnon people I was talking to, and just people in general who, even if they wouldn't, wear a Q pin or say where we go one, we go all, I felt like this kind of concept of this kind of violent cathartic moment had really spread from QAnon and sort of infiltrated more broadly Trumpism. Because, rationally, anyone there, or maybe not the people there, but you look at this and it's like they're doing the electoral vote count. There's really not anything you can do to save Donald Trump's presidency at this point, except unless you believe there's going to be this big moment where you just drag people out and kill them, or essentially overthrow the government. And so the people I was talking to, very normal seeming people in many ways. And then they would just talk about, oh, we can't wait to go lynch Mike Pence, stuff like that. And I felt like, sometimes I gravitate towards maybe the crazier people in the crowd. But, I talked to a lot of people and they all felt this way. And then, of course, it played out. I was struck by, I talked to a woman named Teresa, who was a middle-aged woman from Ohio who had a big Q sign. And, she was saying, there's Satanists in there. We got to go get them. And so, we see this reflected in some of the other riot participants, this sort of vision of the storm that brought them to the riot. I think probably the most visible QAnon believer involved in the riot was Ashley Babbitt, the Air Force veteran who came out from California. I mean, this is someone who had worn QAnon shirts, although, she seems to have been radicalized relatively quickly by QAnon. Her first posts about QAnon are on February 2020, so less than a year, up until she makes it to the riot. The day before the riot, she tweets effectively that the storm is upon us. So she tweets kind of a shout out to the storm, her belief that January 6th would mark the storm. And ultimately, she was shot trying to break into the speaker's lobby by a police officer. So this is someone who, I think we can see the way the storm interacts in people's motivation, in that, you have a police officer telling you to go back down, don't do this. And then she just goes for it. But of course, we have a couple other examples of QAnon believers who have been indicted. I'm struck by the example of a gentleman, Meredith Cleve, I believe, who was a big enough QAnon fan that he had a billboard outside his car wash that said like Q down in Georgia. And this was kind of a locally notorious billboard. Allegedly, according to the FBI, the day of the riot, he's driving to Washington with all these guns. And then he gets to Washington late, but he texts his friend, calm before the storm. So there again, we have the storm. And then, I would say also in sort of a perhaps more mundane way, but in one that I think illustrates the way that the storm works on people. We have FAA employee Kevin Strong, who was already on the FBI's radar before he goes to Washington as just a QAnon guy. Someone had reported that he had a QAnon flag. And I think what's really relevant here for the storm is that he had bought this new truck. And so someone said, how can you afford this new truck? And he said, well, once the storm comes, all my debts will be absolved. And I think that's probably something that sort of is often missed in the larger talk about QAnon, is this, again, this personal aspect of the storm. Ultimately, he, allegedly sort of mills around and had predicted that this would be World War III. Obviously, it didn't happen. And then, just kind of pulling back, so we know all these QAnon believers were involved, and a lot of them seem to have the vision of the storm. After the riot, the tear gas is floating around, I'm walking around, and I run into Teresa, this woman from Ohio I talked to before, and I said, do you think the storm's going to happen now? And she said, it just did, look at that. So, certainly I think unfortunately, I think the events of January 6th have not really deterred a lot of QAnon believers. And in many ways, I think if they feel it was not the storm itself, I think they think they're well on their road to it, thanks to this. And yeah, that's my talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Susannah.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to pick up on this idea of the storm. And I think what we can see the storm as, especially the way that Will's just described it quite capably, is in QAnon, the storm is a millenarian event. That the storm is the point when all the things that they want to happen, arrests, the election, the continued presidency of Donald Trump, everything else they want, all the things they want to happen will happen. And in millenarianism, what the kind of end of the world event often is it's not an end of the world, it's an end of this world. And so in QAnon, the storm marks this pivotal moment from when they're no longer fighting the war against the cabal, but they've won, and their new world where everything that they want to happen begins. And this is kind of like a golden age idea. And I think the storm quite clearly fits into this kind of millenarian framework, and that QAnon has a lot of elements of this. But I want to kind of look a bit more carefully about the idea of conspiracies in terms of like how we can understand conspiracy theories in terms of religion. Because if we're saying it's they had this idea of being a millenarian event, a lot of writers for The Atlantic, a lot of writers who study QAnon talk about QAnon as a new religious movement. And I just want to question that in terms of how we think about conspiracy theories. First, I'm going to talk about a figure that was very prominent in their event on the storm and the siege on the Capitol, which was Jake Anjali. He was this guy, which you probably saw, bare-chested, tattoos all over his torso, a furry hat with horns. And he enters, if you've seen the video, it was on the New Yorker, he enters the Capitol Rotunda when they're with the main building, when they're in the Senate chambers, and he starts doing this loud, boring call. And he calls himself the Q Shaman. And if you watch the videos, what's quite interesting is that he starts doing this kind of like this call, and then he gets told to knock it off by some of the other Q adherents. And instead he starts doing a prayer, a very coherent, legible Christian prayer. And so Jake Anjali really represents this figure who shows the intersection of various different religious currents within QAnon. So obviously there's Christian nationalism on one side, and I feel like that's talked about a lot. But if we look at Jake Anjali in a bit more detail, he's not a Christian nationalist person, I don't think. He's done certain interviews, he's written a book, it's called One Mind at a Time, A Deep State of Illusion. If you want, you can read my analysis of it of Twitter. I wouldn't recommend actually reading the book. And if you read his interviews, if you read his book, he is quite clearly involved in New Age spirituality. He calls himself a shaman. He calls himself a starseed. A starseed is a human who believes they have an alien consciousness inside them. And he talks about a lot of themes which are very prevalent in the New Age, such as creating reality with your own thoughts. He also talks a lot about conspiracies. And what's interesting about this book is it goes through the whole of QAnon, from JFK being the last great president, through to all the accusations of pedophilia, to what we need to do to change the world to make it a better place. But he never once mentions Q, and he never once mentions Donald Trump. So it is entirely possible he wrote this book before he got into the Q drops specifically, because there's a couple of other kind of indications that it was written at least before 2019. And I think what that shows is that both Christian nationalism and the New Age and this whole conspiratorial online milieu somehow came together in QAnon. That what Q did wasn't actually very original. What it did was pull together lots of different currents that were already in existence, especially in online discourses about conspiracies. And in terms of, just to kind of do a bit of a side, the idea of New Age spirituality being deeply invested in conspiracies, it's called conspirituality. And some people find this surprising, because New Age spirituality is meant to be kind of all peace and love and, hippies, and we assume that they're kind of left wing. And this, at least for the past 10 years, I would say, is not entirely correct at all. They are deeply invested in conspiracy theories. And so I did my field work in a place called Sedona, Arizona, I found there were all kinds of conspiracy theories that were very prevalent amongst my interlocutors, such as chemtrails, fluoridation, anti-vaccination, and also political conspiracies. So we shouldn't be surprised necessarily that there are New Agers in QAnon. And I think what's interesting is how both Christian nationalism and New Age spirituality fit into QAnon. And what I want to focus on for a moment is, what can we look at, what can we analyze as the work being done by conspiracy theories politically, as well as socially and psychologically? So it's quite easy to look at QAnon and go, well, this is just false. I think these people might be crazy, right? But false theories, and this is my first point that I really want you all to take home, false theories have real effects socially. A story doesn't need to be true in order for it to motivate real actions. We've just heard of a number of cases from Will of people going to take quite extreme actions based on theories that they have read, which are not correct. So false theories have real actions. There's also people who benefit from the spread of false theories. And here I want to really refer to, there's a lot of work in anthropology on rumor and witchcraft accusations, and the idea that these stories that are told in societies which have no factual content often do things socially. And some of those things can be very detrimental, but for certain people, they can be very beneficial. So we need to think about conspiracies and conspiracy theories as power. If you make up the right story, you can motivate people to do what you want. And I think one of the key kind of hooks of QAnon is it isn't just people telling you what to think. Actually, it's a series of questions often. If you read Q drops, it's these series of questions which are quite cryptic. You know, where is Sommer? When are the arrests? And it kind of gives you ways to test these. You know, so look for the proof, you know, talk to someone from the National Guard, whether they've been activated on the 30th of October. So it allows people to do the analytic work themselves. And in a way, it's a form of critical thinking. It doesn't produce the outcome that we would want critical thinking to produce, but it's a way of analyzing and dissecting and thinking through what's going on. And they're always saying, do your own research, think for yourself. Jake Anjali's book, each section ends with just a series of questions. He never tells you what to think. He's always posing questions to you. So then you are then encouraged to go out and see for yourself what the answers are. And then there are people that are able to benefit from this research process, which are kind of the Q influences, what in some works is called the Q teachers. The people who aggregate the Q drops, which are on this message board, which is quite obscure, but they aggregate it in their YouTube channels. They sell merchandise. They write about it through all their other social media platforms. And these figures have raised quite large followings from spreading Q content. So obviously there's a layer right there that's very obvious that they are benefiting from the expansion of conspiracy theories of QAnon. But there's also a level above that. And another point that I would like everyone to take home with them is that there is a proliferation of conspiracy theories in America right now because American politics is riddled with conspiracies. You know, and this is things that they will raise themselves. So like Jake Anjali in his book will talk about various different conspiracies. Watergate is a classic example. The assassination of JFK is another one. And some of these conspiracies have been proved to be true. And they're, on one level, what is going on at the moment is a conspiracy by people surrounding the president, the most recent president, who fortunately isn't now, to keep hold of power. And the conspiracy theories of QAnon enable this actual political conspiracy of Donald Trump to maintain power. So it's a form of political manipulation. And it's kind of using people who are often in emotional, financial, kind of psychological distress, who want some great change in their life. And it's taking that desire to see great change and it's funneling it in a specific direction that ends up being very socially detrimental. And there's a couple of reasons why I think this is flourishing right now. And one is a loss of trust in institutions. And I think this is really key. When I spoke to people in Sedona who are engaged in New Age spirituality, you know, why do you believe in chemtrails, which is this idea that there's like toxic fumes being spread by airplanes on purpose to control the weather or our brains? And I just didn't believe it because I believed certain authorizing institutions, right? I believe the EPA, I believe the Air Force when they say this isn't happening. And my interlocutors just did not. There's been a massive loss in institutions. In politics, obviously, Congress has a very low approval rating, but also the science, also science and medicine, public health authorities. This is something we're seeing really strongly with the COVID crisis. They're just not being accepted and believed. The media is huge in this as well. So it's kind of hard to, unless you read the Q drops, to see just how prominent it is that the MSN, as they call it, is one of the traitors that QAnon identifies. So there's a huge loss in trust in the media, that nothing that you hear can be believed. Therefore, you have to go research it yourself and find out yourself. And you saw them all with their camera phones during the Capitol siege. That was because they thought they had to be citizen journalists, because everything that in the MSN was released about them would be a lie, that they would be lied about. Therefore, they needed to create their own narrative. They needed to put their own videos out there. So there's this huge loss in institutions. And this powers this kind of need to fill it with this alternative theories. In my work, I call it a counter narrative of conspiracy, that whatever the MSN, if you want to call it that, says, an alternate story is put out immediately as a kind of alternate explanation of what's going on. And what's the effect of this counter narrative of conspiracy? The effect is that it dehumanizes certain people. And when you dehumanize certain groups of people, Democratic politicians, Mike Pence, that gives you license to do things to them as if they were not persons. That's when you get a gallows outside the Capitol. And this is a very dangerous situation to be in, because it's a dynamic that has happened. If you look at other occurrences of genocide, for example, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, what happens first is a dehumanization of political, ethnic, religious opponents. And I think we need to be very careful, therefore, when we look at QAnon and we say things like, well, I think this might be a new religious movement, or this is some kind of false belief. Because I think that there's a temptation to take things that we identify as false and put it into this box called religion, because in terms of the discourse of secularization, that's where false beliefs are made safe. We call it religion, it's someone's own personal business, and then we can kind of push it away. And I think we need to move beyond that, because this isn't just in terms of what people believe privately. This is having real detrimental effects in society that cannot simply be argued against in a very direct way, because the whole institution that we are ourselves a part of, right, in the media for Will and in academia for the rest of us, those institutions have been delegitimized. And so our very way of speaking about these things has already been discredited by the people we're talking about. Thank you.
Great, thank you both so much. You've given us a lot to think about here. I wanted to maybe just get the discussion started with asking you each to kind of respond to each other about the talk at the beginning about the storm. Will, you spoke about it as a utopian dream, and Susannah, you spoke about it as a millenarian event. And those are aligned in certain ways, but they're not quite the same thing. And I was interested at how central the notion of the storm is in both of your presentations. And if you want to parse the terms that you're using a little bit so that we can think about how this particular manifestation of imagining some alternative future is millenarian, apocalyptic, and utopian kind of all at the same time. And where you'd kind of put the weight of one or the other in your analysis of what this idea is.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think Susannah's, I think, using the proper terminology in terms of, millenarian. I'll have to, that's fabulous. I'm going to be adding that to my repertoire. But yeah, I mean, I think this, the question of the storm, it's an interesting one, because for the QAnon believer, it is both one of like incredible violence and, at best mass arrests. But really that's kind of like wink, wink. We know what really is going to happen. But there's this kind of like purge, this catharsis. But then after that, this kind of like just wonderful world. I mean, if you watch one of the Joe M's videos, some of these original videos that like baseball pitcher Curt Schilling got into, it basically proposes that after the storm, there will be no problems in the world. It's like wars will be gone, famine will be gone, illness will be gone. So yeah, I mean, it is this kind of climactic moment. And then after that, the world's great.
Yeah, so that's basically classic millenarianism, right? You can basically draw a diagram of the millenarian event, right? So before it, and I guess if I'm going to be really technical, I'm talking about pre-millenarianism. I don't want to get too into the religious studies jargon. So before the millenarian event, you have something that resembles some large conflict. In Christian eschatology, this is the tribulation, right? That's the war of good against evil. And then you get your millenarian event. That's when everything is revealed. Apocalypse means unveiling, right? Revealing. And after the millenarian event, everything is great in the perspective of the people who are saved. So therefore, all these terms in a way are translatable, right? Because the utopia is what's created after the millenarian event for those who were saved. If you were not one of the saved, you probably died or were somehow or other ejected from the plane of reality that they're now on. Because in some millenarian conceptions, kind of the event can literally be the elector kind of raised up to another plane of existence. But if you want to talk about classic Christian eschatology, which is what most people are probably familiar with, after the second coming of Christ, you get the golden age of his rule on earth. And that's when everything that those who believe in this system, that's when all the things that they want come to be. And it is very common for people to translate this on a personal level. So New Age millenarianism is based on this idea of the shift or the ascension. That's when we ascend to a higher dimension of existence. We're currently in the 3D, that's bad. After the ascension, we go to the 5D, that's much better. And people would talk to me about it like, oh, and then I won't have any debt. All financial problems will be resolved. There will be no capitalism, basically. So it's kind of this entire reworking of social organization that becomes this kind of beneficial, perfected society for those who believe in the system that that you're talking about. So I think these things are all connected, basically.
One of the things that when I teach about apocalypticism and millenarianism that appears again and again in different iterations and different examples is the what happens when a movement's expectations are not met by history, by lived existence. And in some cases, movements, just go away. In other cases, they recalibrate. They recount, they have a different calendar that they come up with. But in some cases, they actually just turn into regular old social movements, right? And get kind of normalized and rationalized. In the work that either one of you has done, or maybe both of you, can you say a little bit about what you expect is going to happen in the QAnon movement now that the storm of January 6th did not produce the results that were expected or hoped for? I've seen some journalism that's reported on, confusion, disappointment, et cetera. Maybe we're too close to it to know what's going to happen, but do you have any predictions about how this apocalyptic disappointment is going to get resolved for these communities of people?
Yeah, so this is the kind of classic when prophecy fails study. That is the name of a book from 1956 by Leon Festinger and others. So he was the psychologist who came up with the term cognitive dissonance, which he described as the gap between reality and what the group, in that case, it was a UFO group who thought they were going to be taken up on a spaceship. What happens after that doesn't happen because it has to be incorporated somehow. And he came up with this kind of typology, which really does bear out for many of the other apocalyptic or millenarian events that have been disappointed, which is that some people will drop out immediately. They will say, well, that didn't happen. That was obviously false. I'm going to go home and lick my wounds kind of thing. The next option is they say, as you said, they recalibrate. They set a new date. New date setting is classic. I was wrong. I did the calculations wrong. It's actually going to happen on, 2022 or whatever. Another way is to say it did happen, it just happened in another plane of existence, or like you can only see it if you believe in it kind of thing. And I've been through this myself. I went out on the 21st of December 2012 in Sedona. That was kind of the end of the Mayan long count calendar. If you remember back then, there was a whole other kind of millenarian expectation among certain groups on that date. And I was standing on a rock for 14 hours with someone who thought he was going to walk through a portal. at 11 a.m. and kind of fix reality as he saw it. And that didn't happen. We just sat up on that rock, and after 14 hours, we all came down. And he was very depressed for a couple of weeks. And then he decided that actually it was going to happen in 2018. Not 2012, it was going to be the winter solstice in 2018. And the reason why he decided that was because he benefited from his system of beliefs. It gave him something that he found meaningful and worthwhile in his life. And a lot of QAnon adherents find this fantastical conspiracy theory beneficial, like it's part of being in a community. Maybe it gives them a new way to think about their life. Maybe it literally gives them a new way of making money. There's a whole different range of benefits that people derive from millenarian beliefs, from conspiracy theories. And if QAnon is still being found to be beneficial by people, it will keep going. And what I see is that there's all kinds of people who are still benefiting from QAnon. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, would we even know who she is as a first-time congresswoman if she wasn't into QAnon? I think it will continue. And I think it will continue for the reason that the adherents want it to.
Yeah, I mean, I think Susannah summed it up well. I mean, I think, January had two big dates for QAnon believers, January 6th and, of course, January 20th. And, if you looked at the QAnon chat rooms and stuff right up until maybe 15 minutes before Biden and Kamala Harris were sworn in, they were like, whoa, they still expected the storm to happen. And they kept saying, well, Trump's cutting it a little close. He's going to have to jump out from behind the curtain real quick. And then, of course, when Biden is sworn in, they go, the report, the main feeling was one of like physical revulsion. It was like, I want to throw up. I feel like an idiot. I was telling all my friends and family how dumb they were going to look because, my 3-year obsession with QAnon was about to be vindicated. But then, of course, that didn't happen. And so, but then within a couple hours, so, it looks like, oh, QAnon's been defeated. But then a couple hours later, of course, they're kind of like circling the wagons and they figured out the rationales. And I think the leading one right now is that, this is all really going to happen on March 4th because that's the old inauguration date. And now Trump's really going to be inaugurated then. And I do think, on the margins, people are going to kind of float away, hopefully. But I think, QAnon as a force is still going. I think in the best case scenario, the QAnon brand becomes so tarnished that it morphs into something else in the same way that Pizzagate sort of morphed into QAnon after the shooting at Comet Ping Pong. It sort of becomes, people are like, well, I kind of look like a dummy if I say I believe in QAnon, but maybe I just kind of get into this new thing that's essentially still QAnon.
Thank you. So we do have some questions coming in on the Q&A here. One question that comes up that might help us kind of situate QAnon in relationship to some of its perhaps fellow travelers, people who have strategically aligned themselves in some ways with the Q movement is what's in it for white evangelicals and Catholics who align with or support QAnon, and I'll just add a little bit of something to that question, which is how do they make the pieces fit together ideologically and theologically?
I have to defer to Susannah on that, I think.
How do they make the various different conspiracy theories fit together?
Well, the question was first about why white evangelicals and Catholics would align themselves with QAnon. What do they get, and how do they sort of resolve the different ideological points of friction or conflict that they might encounter in that alliance?
Yeah, so I think QAnon appeals especially to evangelical white Christians because of the links with Christian nationalism, which is something much larger and much bigger than QAnon. And the work of Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry is excellent if you want to read more about Christian nationalism. But it's this idea that America is a Christian country, Jesus is white, and God wants America to kind of prosper and be number one, essentially, because all these kind of concepts are interlinked. It's like kind of a sanctification of both whiteness and Christianity, and kind of, it's also very English speaking. I think there's something very Anglophonic about it. So all these people are excluded basically from the white Christian nation and Christian nationalism. And a lot of their language has been co-opted and moved into QAnon. So for example, there was a video on Parler that was released by one of the kind of quite strongly QAnon pastors. And it kind of had cut versions of Trump's speeches, and it talked about how, this is it, this is the war, you've got to put on your armor of God, which is an Ephesians reference, and they see themselves as fighting a war of good against evil. And so that's how it kind of blended very easily into QAnon. So the heart of QAnon is that there are these criminals who are corrupting America. And in Christian nationalism, the idea that America is in decline because of demographic change, because of civil rights and social justice. So it needs to be purified. And so I think in QAnon and Christian nationalism, this very kind of dangerous drive towards making America a certain thing and making like real Americans as a certain type of person came together very strongly. Now, what's interesting is when you kind of look at Christian nationalists, you wouldn't normally see them as the kind of people who would ever want to have something to do with Jake Anjali, for example. And one thing I think is important to understand about QAnon is it's a very broad movement, and you can be engaged in it just on your computer. And you don't necessarily have to talk to other people who are involved in QAnon in real life. So you may not know that Jake Anjali calls him a shaman is one thing. You may just engage with the parts of it that you want. You may be very into the parts of it that talk about fighting a battle of good versus evil and wearing your armor of God. And you may just completely ignore the people who say that, well, maybe Q is not an alien. There's lots of different parts, and they're not necessarily in communication. And it's not a homogenous movement. There are certain points of convergence, and there are definitely people who will hold on to some of those points more strongly than others. But because it's so interpretable, because the drops are so vague, because you can decide Q is basically whoever you think Q is, you can see it from many different angles, and you don't necessarily need to engage with the bits that you don't want to engage with. And I would also say that one thing that was very, very indicative, I think, at least to me, is how quickly the other parts of QAnon turned against Jake Anjali. They immediately called him a crisis actor. He had a page on backstage.com or whatever it is, which is just like a website. Like I could have a page on there, doesn't mean I'm an actor. But they were like, no, this means he's a crisis actor. He's here to discredit the movement. He would never be one of us. So there is disharmony, if you want to call it that, within QAnon itself about what QAnon is. It's not a settled question. There are definitely conflicts between the different kind of adherents. And, one thing that we can maybe, if we're going to look at, how does this end? Where does it go? The fractures between the various different parts will probably increase. And that's a good thing from the perspective of people who want QAnon to disappear, but it means that they might go off in their separate directions. The people who are more in the kind of alien Gnostic side of QAnon might split away totally from the people who are more kind of invested in the Christian nationalist side of QAnon.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, if you go to these QAnon rallies and stuff, you see how for evangelical Christians, often QAnon is almost like an expansion pack or something for like what they believe. And it's sort of like the, a lot of the people involved in QAnon are very into the book of Revelation. And so these are people who see like the devil's not like a metaphor for them. It's like a real person or force that they are doing battle with in their daily lives. And I think for one thing, that makes it kind of a more exciting way to view the world, which is, they call themselves digital soldiers, right? And they're just on their computers. I mean, I'm on my computer. It's not that glamorous, but you can kind of like spice it up that way. I'm struck when I see these speeches they give, where often they sort of intersperse biblical references, just as Susannah mentioned with the armor of God. They intersperse biblical references with Q references to Q drops and kind of back and forth. But yeah, I mean, I do think the divisions and sort of the ways that different groups of QAnon of believers have developed, you can kind of have your old mainline QAnon people who are more likely to look like Trump supporters, evangelical Christians. And then, especially last summer, we see the Save the Children, what you might call West Coast or Los Angeles QAnon. And these are people a lot more crunchy, a lot more like the Q Shaman. And then this first group goes, these people are like a false flag operation. This is the deep state coming after us, because that doesn't look like our brand of QAnon. And so I think there's a lot, even within the religious groups, I think there's some interesting developments there.
Two questions come up that are not exactly linked to each other, but they're linked to things that you both have already talked about a little bit. One has to do with, is there something peculiarly American about QAnon? And the second one is, the question of, given that this is predominantly a digital phenomenon, that this is a community that exists online primarily, although of course came together on January 6th in Washington, DC. Is there evidence of interest or activity to establish actual living communities of believers, to learn together, expand material and spiritual resources to be better prepared? Is there, any sense that there's a kind of institutionalizing move? And I'll just tag onto that question. What's going to happen when the language of heresy starts to enter into the discussion, such that, as Will, you've just mentioned, some Q people saying the other Q people aren't really Q people, they're false flag people, and so on. And so how, what do you see happening as this movement continues to grow and morph and change and so on? Okay.
I mean, certainly in the case of, it's so interesting you bring up like sort of lived communities. My mind instantly goes to a QAnon community out in Arizona based around a figure named Austin Steinbart, who he goes by the alias Baby Q. He claims he's Q visiting from the future, blah, blah, blah. It's a whole thing. But he's been able to assemble a community of 20 people, probably at its largest, who are all living together and kind of devoted to him as this figure. Now, within QAnon, there's a very marginal viewpoint, but it does have I realize cult is sort of a technical term, but it has a lot of the ideas around kind of like worship of this one dude. Of course, now he's in federal prison awaiting, various charges, but we can see the growth of these kind of QAnon communities. Absolutely.
Yeah, it would be Arizona, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and he's buddies with the Q Shaman, so there you go.
Of course he is. Yeah, so I've also heard about plans amongst various kind of well-known people in spirituality circles to start some kind of commune or community. And I mean, at least from the things I study, this is entirely to be expected. Like the kind of end point of New Age spirituality is often, and then we start our own off-grid community away from, the mainstream where we have solar power and we grow our own food, and, it's all a bit 70s back to the land in some ways. And there's definitely one of these being proposed in Texas, Austin, Texas, and it's kind of crossing over with the libertarian sea cities that I think Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, wants to start. This idea of kind of starting your own autonomous communities in international waters. So they're actually raising funds to start one in Texas, where they're going to build a community. And JP Sears, who's a spiritual influencer who used to do funny videos, and now he does all these kind of anti-Biden, anti-coronavirus videos, which are much less funny. There's him, and there's a few other Mickey Willis, the Plandemic guys, involved as well. Yeah, Plandemic is also into this as well. So yeah, there are kind of moves to start some kind of off-grid community. But in my experience, these communities either don't get past the planning stage, or if they actually get founded, they're not realized well. It's pretty hard to start a utopian community off-grid in modern day America. The state will always be there somehow, and no one ever does their right amount of effort compared to the effort that everyone else thinks they're going into. So generally they all start arguing and falling apart. So I don't think that there's a very viable long-term future in terms of QAnon communities, but I might be wrong. We'll see.
Unmute. We have a question. Now that QAnon has been kicked off Facebook and its access to social media has been heavily curtailed, has its spread been slowed down and its virulence weakened? And that is, if part of the power of QAnon is its social media video game addictive aspect, what happens when users are cut off from the dopamine hit they get from online activity? Will they go into recovery, or will they find other equally disturbing forms of cognitive dissonance?
Just going to say no. So for one thing, QAnon hasn't been kicked off Facebook. The main groups have been shut down. The really big influence have been shut down. But there's all kinds of what they call micro influencers and small groups where you can still talk about QAnon content, but they kind of use symbols and like other words to kind of avoid the algorithms. So QAnon is still out there, and the kind of themes and ideas that they're spreading, you can talk about child trafficking, for example. It's still all there. Facebook groups are one of the worst, but there's also this whole other ecosystem of alternative social media sites. They just moved on to Telegram, they moved on to Gab, they moved on to Parler, which are not moderated, which are already populated by far-right groups. And it means that actually the people who are involved in QAnon are more likely to get further radicalized by the far right, by people like neo-Nazis who are already in these social media spaces. And they're then saying, oh, look, you got shut down by, big tech. They're obviously part of the deep state. We're also red-pilled. And they kind of draw them into even worse even worse theories, even worse groups. And it actually makes people more vulnerable because QAnon it's got quite a lot of mainstream people in it right now. And I think if they're all being pushed onto these very unmoderated spaces, then they're going to get exposed to things which can actually lead them even further down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a double-edged sword, or there's positive aspects and negative ones. I think on one hand, cracking down on QAnon does force these groups into sort of more extreme areas. They're harder for folks like us to monitor, as well as the government, and also put them in places where you may have someone who maybe got into QAnon because of the relatively benign, like Save the Children front group, and then suddenly they're being pushed onto Telegram where they're hanging out with neo-Nazis. Conversely, they're certainly pushing them off of places like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. It deprives them of a large potential pool of recruits. And people aren't going to be people who are joining these Telegram groups are probably already pretty into QAnon. Versus, if you're not seeing it and you're your high school friend posting it on Facebook and you say, what's that? And you get into it from there. So, I think the fact that these groups are kind of at least engaged in kind of a cat and mouse game now with the moderators is positive in terms of cutting down on their recruitment.
Two questions I'll put together. One is to come back to the question about, is this a peculiarly American phenomenon that we actually didn't talk about? And then related, I think, to that question is, why Donald Trump? Why is QAnon attached to him as a figure?
Sure. I mean, it certainly, I obviously, so many other countries and cultures have conspiracy theories. But, sometimes when I'm just really in the thick of it at a QAnon event, I mean, it just seems so American. It's like one of these post-election rallies, and there was a guy with a spear, and they were just screaming at Antifa. And this guy was like, I'm Red Pill Ken, and all this stuff. And it just felt just fair. I felt like it was in Robert Altman's Nashville. It was just a real slice of Americana. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think there is certainly this sense of America as both the savior of as kind of the protagonist of the world, in that QAnon is it's going after a global cabal, but it will be saved through America. And then in terms of why Donald Trump, I mean, I think he just sort of in some ways just sort of happens to be a very unique figure at a time when social media is powering a lot of this stuff. And of course, he's also, he used to be, until January 20th, the most powerful conspiracy theorist in the world. I mean, this is a guy who did a lot to mainline this kind of thought. So I don't think it's surprising that people who would tend towards that in the first place would kind of latch on to him.
Yeah, so I'd say it's very American in its presentation. If you look at the details of QAnon, that seems, incredibly American. But if you look at it on a more kind of structural level, obviously conspiracy theories exist everywhere. Rumors, false stories, false narratives, they exist everywhere. So it's not that there is a kind of giant wide-ranging conspiracy theory. I don't think it's particularly American. But I think you also need to look at the position of America in the world, that it is the predominant military power. And you might even call it an empire. And that it is in this, you could see how the position of America is changing in the world. And this kind of experience of decline amongst Americans is something that I've observed. So I'm not actually American, I'm British. I just study America. And it was always very odd to me when people just say, oh, it's terrible. It's in decline. It's going down the toilet. And I would be like, why? You guys literally have the biggest economy and army in the world. To a European, it was kind of weird. But this sense of decline, I think, is very strong in QAnon as a motivating, an emotional motivating factor, that you feel like things are getting worse. And then someone comes along with this explanation for that feeling that you have of decline. So I think it has a lot to do with America's position in the world and how that's changing. So I don't think it's a historical coincidence at all. I think kind of this proliferation of conspiracy theories is something that we can identify when empires start to fail. And the other part of that, sorry, I've forgotten the other part of that.
Why Donald Trump?
Why Donald Trump? Yes, okay. So I think it's two reasons. Like, it's kind of surprising that it's Donald Trump in some ways, because Donald Trump is, he is part of the elite. He's best buddies with Jeffrey Epstein. Whenever I see there's a reference in Jake Anjali's book to Jeffrey Epstein and his best buddies, the Clintons. And I'm like, yeah, but also Donald Trump, right? So it's kind of weird that he's not somehow included in this elite cabal of pedophiles, isn't it? But I think, so it's like, I think he's an opportunist, for one thing. I think he saw things that were going on that he could take advantage of for his own personal political gain. And I think partly it was the way he was presented by others around him and the way he presented himself, right? He really presented himself as this, if you want to say, populist figure, that he was on the side of the forgotten Americans, right? It was all there in that awful inauguration speech about American carnage, right? He was going to save you all and your like starving children in your rundown cities. Like, these are the same themes of decline, right? And he's setting himself up as an almost like messianic figure to save people from that. So I think that's kind of why Donald Trump is, because like he wanted himself to be this figure and he took advantage of the kind of conspiracy that are out there, but the way he presented himself really fit into the narrative of good versus evil. Like, he was the leader on the side of good, if you will.
Okay, I have two final questions that I'm going to put together, so that you'll be able to sort of wrap up for us. One has to do with asking you to say a little bit more about the relationship between Q, the storm, and American democracy. This questioner writes, it seems central to the Q narrative that there will be some sort of restoration of, quote, the people to their proper place. It also seems striking that despite some anti-institutional sentiments, the theories are centered around bad actors, not bad institutions. So it's the satanic pedophiles or the Jews or Antifa or whoever who's hijacked the institutions, not the institutions themselves. So that's one question. And then the other question is, does this movement just either proliferate or peter out or whatever, or are there actual strategies that people who are concerned about this movement could activate that would address it in a way that would address the anxieties that are being channeled through this movement? Are there ways to address the cognitive dissonance, the disinformation, et cetera? Are there, obviously, presenting the truth and the facts is not necessarily persuasive or rhetorically effective. So is there something to do about QAnon, or is it just a matter that we observe it and write about it and analyze it and carry on?
Sure. I mean, I think QAnon, what to do about it is a very complicated question. I've talked to a lot of people who are, who have looked at this more seriously than I have, and in terms of how do you de-radicalize people. And often, I think on the personal level, I hear from so many people who have lost a family member or a close friend to QAnon. And unfortunately, I think the answer right now is, presuming you value this relationship, is sort of, it's a very kind of slog of sort of waiting until they have this moment of cognitive dissonance where, let's say Biden's elected, and then you say, geez, looks like maybe Q was wrong, in a very loving way. In terms of how we deal with this as a society, I really don't know. I mean, I think more broadly, better social welfare services to, so that people don't end up in these desperate situations that they try to kind of avoid with QAnon. But, and what was the other question?
The other question had to do, oops, I'm still muted. Am I muted?
No, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry, the delay on the messaging. The other question had to do with, is this really an anti-institutional movement? The questioner was pointing out that so many of the bad who's identified as bad or bad actors rather than institutions necessarily. And is there a way to think about the relationship then of QAnon and this movement to ideas about American democracy and about the desire to restore power to the people, which is a kind of abstraction that occurs.
Sure. I mean, certainly there is this sense I think a lot of QAnon believers have of this. They almost want to go back to this very like idealized, like hundreds of years ago, American, like an agrarian republic, or they see these institutions as corrupted, like the FBI, and yet they love the NSA and stuff. Like, I mean, it doesn't make a ton of sense. But really, I think at its heart, QAnon is in so many ways like a very like fascist vision of wouldn't it be great? We have such a good country if only we could just get rid of like everyone I don't like, and we're not going to have this kind of tug of war politics forever. We just kill them all. And so yeah, in that way, I mean, they love the Constitution except for like the non-storm parts.
Yeah. So I did mention earlier that it's like about a loss of trust in institutions, and I would definitely say that's institutions as they're currently constituted. There is still faith in those institutions, that those institutions have been taken over by bad actors. And you can see this in conspiracy theories of all levels, so that, when people discuss, for example, chemtrails, they do so using the scientific method, right? Or their version of it. They present you with all these tables and figures, and then they say, look, this shows that there's all these levels of what we call heavy metals in the atmosphere. So they're using a version of the scientific method. They're not saying, using a recourse to prophecy, for example. They're not using a recourse to like some other form of authority. They're using science. They're just saying that the science that we have has been corrupted. And I think that's the same with QAnon and our democratic institutions. They're saying, these institutions have been taken over by the evil cabal, and we need to purify them, essentially. We need to take them over, and we need to eject all the people who don't fit our idea of what a real American is. And that's why it fits so neatly with Christian nationalism, because it's all this idea about taking our country back. And obviously we can talk for a long time about whose country, who is us. The question I always ask of populism is who is the people? And in America, you've got this kind of founding kind of paradox almost, and this was something that was identified by the anthropologist David Graeber, that America was founded on a revolution, which is an illegal act, and you then had to legalize an illegal act. That meant the potential for that act to reoccur is always there, right? The people can restore the original purified kind of America of their dreams, essentially. That's why I think the founders and the Constitution are so kind of fetishized. And it's this sense of kind of getting rid of everything that they identify as responsible for the decline and returning in this kind of very restorationist, we can also talk about like the restorationist churches. They do a very similar maneuver, kind of restore that original purity, right? So that's what I think, the institutions are good, we just need to purify them. And that is as sinister as I just made it sound, I think. The other question is about, strategies to help. How do we address anxieties? What can we do? And I think there's two ways, kind of like how Will addressed this question. There's two ways we can look at this. What can I do personally about people that I know who are into QAnon, and what should we do as a society? On the first one, I would say, if you know people, I have people in my family who are into QAnon, just don't try it. Like, you cannot convince people by sitting there talking one-on-one that they are wrong on something this big, right? They've already seen where you are. They've already decided that you're wrong. They've already decided you're part of like the lie, that you're the sheeple and you're asleep, and they've gone their own direction. And you can talk about this in a kind of an analogous way. I don't use the word cults, but people who are in small religious groups, there's a lot of talk about like, how do you get them out? You don't. It's their choice. Sooner or later, they will make that decision for themselves. Either they will have to, or they will choose to. But it's also kind of like, if you have a friend who's in a terrible relationship, you can tell them that guy sucks all day long, but they're the ones that are going to get them out of that relationship. So I'd say on a personal level, if you know someone in your life who's invested in this, just don't disappear from their life, right? Because the thing that drives people away is feeling like they have nothing left to lose, and all their family and friends have abandoned them because they believe this crazy Q theory. So if you just talk to them about something else, maintain the relationship however you can, if it's safe to do so, but just don't try and alienate them too much, is what I would say. Be there for them when they reach that point and they're like, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore. You can just be like, okay, great, let's go for dinner. As a societal level, there are things we should do, and we should definitely do them. One is leadership. You know, QAnon spread because it got authorized by Donald Trump. You know, he retweeted QAnon beliefs. That you can't ignore that level of leadership, I think. And, you know, we should definitely not be electing to Congress people who are invested in QAnon. You know, so there's, you know, leadership should definitely not be involved in these kind of conspiracy theories, and they should be absolutely rejected. You know, big tech, the platforms, social media platforms, absolutely have a responsibility to get this content out of their systems as much as they can, as much as it's possible. And there are all kinds of social welfare programs that, yes, you should absolutely get them in America. You should have things like social medicine. You should have things like benefits for parents. You should have like free preschool, because then people's lives won't be so hard and they won't be in so much personal turmoil. And then they won't look on the internet and say, why am I in so much turmoil? Oh, it's because of the cabal. You know, there are so many things you could do in America to make people's lives easier and safer. And we should definitely do those things.
That seems like a really utopian point at which to wrap our discussion up after 3 o'clock. So I want to thank both of you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us, and engaging with the audience, and thank everyone for being here with us. And if you if we didn't get to your question, the panelists may get in touch over email. We do have the questions saved. So thanks very much to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.